Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Sagan National Colloquium event at Ohio Wesleyan. My name is Laurie Anderson, and I'm a professor of botany microbiology here at Ohio Wesleyan, and I'm also co-director of the 2013 Sagan National Colloquium, along with my colleague Craig Jackson from the Department of Mathematics. I'd like to remind you to silence your cell phones as we start this evening's event. And I'd also like to remind you that we will have a book signing for Dr. Schimel's books. They're available for purchase right outside the door from our local Beehive bookstore. And after the event, you can come up and get your book signed. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to give you a quick history of the Sagan National Colloquium. Established in 1984, Ohio Wesleyan's Sagan National Colloquium annually explores an issue of enduring and powerful social concern from multiple educational angles. The colloquium forges links between liberal arts learning and the lifelong civic art of informed, involved citizenship. In 1999, the colloquium was endowed by 1948 Ohio Wesleyan alumni John and Margaret Sagan, who tirelessly dedicated their expertise and energy to their alma mater throughout their lives, significantly benefiting the university and its students. This year, the theme of the Sagan National Colloquium is interdisciplinary impacts of climate change. And this particular evening, we're very pleased, in partnership with the Department of Botany and Microbiology, to have Dr. David Schimel from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory as our speaker. Dr. Schimel received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Hampshire College and his PhD from Colorado State University. Dr. Schimel is an ecologist whose research focuses on interactions among the biosphere, atmosphere, and geological processes. He's the author of 7 books and over 150 scientific publications, and he's held a number of leadership positions in the scientific community, including serving as CEO and principal investigator of the National Ecological Observatory Network and director of the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry. Dr. Schimel has received many prestigious awards recognizing his work, including being elected as a fellow in the Ecological Society of America and the American Geophysical Union, and receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 as a convening lead author on the 4th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Schimel.
Thanks, everybody. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here. I think that this is a great topic to explore as an interdisciplinary challenge. And also one that is, I think, fairly obviously one that is a great challenge to our civil society. It's one of the profound interactions between science and society, and one that I think is still deeply unresolved. I'm going to talk about the interaction of climate and ecosystems. It's a subject that I've worked on in one way or another for really all of my career. I had the privilege as an undergraduate of showing slides. Some of you may still remember actual slides that academics made to show their work. They were made with cameras and film, and artists had to do the drawings. As a projectionist, I was able to sit in on several of the earliest meetings on climate and the carbon cycle. And I've been fascinated by the topic ever since. I think I've been interested in it because I'm interested in the connections between different areas, and the carbon cycle is one of the quintessential areas in which you can be a specialist and a generalist at the same time. Working on the carbon cycle, some people might think now, and certainly would have thought 20 years ago, that studying the carbon cycle was a fairly specialized topic. But to study the carbon cycle, you need to think first about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's sort of meteorology. But about half of the missing carbon dioxide, the fossil fuel carbon that doesn't remain in the atmosphere, goes into the oceans. And so you need to understand about ocean chemistry and circulation. Then the other part of the carbon that doesn't remain in the atmosphere goes into the biosphere. And so you need to know something about ecology and forest growth, soil processes, and so on. But the forcing, the cause of this whole problem is the human use of fossil fuels. And that is somehow an interaction between economics, engineering, energy systems, and human cultures. So to think about the carbon cycle, if you go to a carbon cycle meeting, you find a group of people who are probably most unusually interested in a lot of different things that is not mapped well into the usual academic boxes. And I think that this really epitomizes many of our environmental challenges. They don't map on to our usual way of breaking the world down into boxes. And what I'm going to talk about tonight are the ways in which the physical climate system and the living things of the terrestrial part of the planet, I'd love to talk about the oceans as well, but we only have an hour or so. How these two great spheres, the biosphere and the atmosphere, and to some extent the oceans, interact together and interact with human activities. Now let me see if I can figure out this advanced mechanism. So this is the shameless commerce moment. There's already been an advertisement for the book. About 3 years ago, I was approached to write this book by one of the editors from Princeton University Press. And it's part of a series, so if you're interested in my book, you should look at the other books as well. They cover everything from an in-depth treatment of the carbon cycle on timescales as long as the evolution of the planet, the physics of the climate system in the atmosphere, in the oceans, the cryosphere, the history of climate on Earth, and how atmospheres function on the other planets of the solar system. So it's a great series, and it's intended to be reasonably readable. And I use reasonably as a careful adjective because some of the books are harder than others. But it's a really nice way of looking at the pieces of the system and some of their connections together. And ordinarily I would have said, I don't have time to write a book. I don't want to write a book. Nobody reads books, and certainly no one's going to buy it. But the idea of being able to put some of these ideas together in one place in a form that was not too long, but longer than a typical journal article, in the end was just too tempting. And so this book is kind of my view of how the pieces of the Earth system fit together. Well, what are the pieces of the Earth system? This is a very important diagram from a report that was produced for NASA in the 1980s. And it tried really to crystallize a sort of post-disciplinary view of the Earth system. And I say post-disciplinary rather than interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, because the author of this, Francis Bretherton, one of my mentors, thought that the way to think about the Earth, rather than requiring the collaboration of a number of scientific disciplines, was to instead assert that understanding the planet required studying the planet, not breaking it down into disciplines that were perhaps first identified by monks in the medieval period at British universities, but to step back and look at the planet and look at its fundamental processes, follow the flows of energy and matter, and then think about what those critical connections were. And when Francis did this, he looked at the composition of the atmosphere, the troposphere and the stratosphere, the role of the water cycle, both water flowing over the land, in the oceans, and as vapor and aerosols and clouds in the atmosphere. But he also looked at human activities as being an integral part of the Earth system. And I call this sort of post-disciplinary because Francis basically argued that the discipline we should all be moving towards is Earth system science. We should be seeking to understand the planet as an integrated whole where, depending on the time scale and the area over which you might be interested, you would emphasize different aspects, but you would always remember that all of these processes were in some sense interacting with each other in a generally inseparable way. And this is the framework in which I've tried to write, and in which I'll try and give you just a few examples tonight of how we think. But this is the system that is now rapidly evolving in response to a wide variety of human activities. And I'll talk quite a bit about the carbon cycle. I'm not going to focus on it right now. But the carbon cycle is, in some sense, one of the main currencies that links the biosphere, the atmosphere, and human activities. Well, why does it do that? It does that because living things are made of carbon, mostly. Actually, mostly made of water, but aside from the water, mostly made of carbon. So carbon is the energy currency of living things. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is one of the most potent controls over the energy balance in the atmosphere, and you've probably heard a great deal about that in this series. But carbon is also the essence of our energy system. And so carbon is intrinsically an integrating way of thinking about the Earth system. As you walk down the path of studying carbon, you wind up looking at many other things like solar power or convection in the free atmosphere. But in the end, it's a useful currency. It's like money. It ties a lot of different things together. You can make it by teaching and spend it by buying a car. Carbon is a little bit like that. And climate shapes life. What do we mean by that? Well, when we look at the Earth, whether we look at it from satellite images or maps like this, we can see that there are strong enough correlations between the patterns of life on the planet and the patterns of climate that there has to be a relationship. And I'll tell you right now that nobody really understands what that relationship is, despite actually centuries of study, beginning perhaps with von Humboldt over 100 years ago to the present day. There are many theories. You'll hear people talk about species energy theory or the velocity of climate change. But the reality is we don't really understand why tropical systems are more diverse, why high latitude systems are less diverse. But there has to be some relationship between life and climate and the opportunities for different types of organisms in different physical environments. And we can clearly see these relationships. We really don't have a theory. We have many theories to explain this, but no one of them has really won out in the marketplace of ideas. At the same time, productivity, the amount of carbon fixed per unit time, the rate of photosynthesis by plants, is also very clearly related to climate. And in this image, green is high productivity, reds and yellows are lower productivity, and you can see what we all know, that productivity is high in the tropics, it's relatively low in the high latitude and arid regions, the polar regions and the deserts, and it's intermediate in the mid-latitudes where we live. So if we look at this, we see a relationship to climate. It's not one-to-one. There's not a single climate variable, temperature or rainfall or solar radiation. But again, we can see intuitively that climate is somehow shaping the uptake of carbon by living organisms on the planet. When we look in the oceans, we see similar patterns, although they're related to the climate in very, very different ways from on land. All of this is changing very rapidly. The last 1,000 to 10,000 years have been a time of relative climate stability. And I say relative because we all know from our own memories, from stories, from history, and perhaps from some knowledge of the record of of millennial changes, that it hasn't been constant. We had a little ice age period. We've had some warm periods. We are, I think, all aware of greater or lesser droughts that have occurred over the past 100 or thousands of years. Historians believe that severe droughts hundreds of years ago have influenced the fates of cultures. But this is a new way of looking at this. It emerged in a paper that was published just 4 years ago, and this is a map of the rate at which an organism would have to migrate in order to maintain its present relationship to climate over the next 100 years using a prediction from a climate model. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you imagine a small rodent that only lives where it's 0 degrees and no colder in the wintertime, and that temperature is moving north as the world warms, that is, where they used to live no longer gets down to 0, and for some reason this organism needs to get down to 0, maybe to fight disease. How fast would that organism have to migrate in order to maintain its present relationship to climate? Well, it turns out that the highest rate recorded over the last 10,000 years, since the last deglaciation, is about 1 kilometer a year. Okay, that's the highest rate known in the last 10,000 years. That is now today the average rate of change predicted for the entire planet. So for the next 100 years, we expect the average rate of change to be as high as any organism on the planet has ever experienced in its recent evolutionary past. But if you look carefully at this map, which is slightly distorted by a Macintosh to PC transition, you can see those red areas. Those red areas are areas where the rate of climate change is predicted to require organisms to migrate at 10 kilometers per year. That's 10 times faster than we're aware that any organism has ever migrated. Now, of course, there might have been even higher rates of change in the very remote past. Here, we're only relating this to the last 10,000 years. So we're predicting a world in which rates of change exceed all those that we know reasonably directly by a factor of 10. So we're looking at a century of extraordinarily rapid change between climatically determined distributions that, in some sense, have stabilized over the last 10,000 years and what we expect to have happen. At the same time, land use and human populations are expanding. This is just a map of the increase and decreases in population of the U.S. over the last 50 years or so. And you can see that for the most part, population density is increasing quite significantly, although there are areas where it's decreasing very significantly. We might think that that would be good for nature, but if you look at the agricultural Midwest, the drier parts of it, and you ask yourself, why are human populations going down? They're going down because farming is moving from small farm units to very large farm units. So it's at least conceivable that this low human population environment is less hospitable, contains less diverse landscapes than the previous higher human density landscapes. And at the same time as that, we're also throwing the biota of the planet into a blender and mixing it all up by moving species all around. So we now have organisms that are occurring in areas where they did not evolve, where they don't have natural predators, or where they have now a prey or a plant that they can feed on that has no defenses against them. And we're looking not only then at the natural process of change with climate, but that being confounded by the fact that people like to move organisms around, either to plant in our gardens or because we suck them up into bilge water, or they hopped a ride with a bushel of bananas. This is a figure from the book, and I include it because it just captures in a very simple way why we really believe that climate and life are related. And this is just a figure showing the zonation of ecosystems with elevation or depth, pointing out that as you go up, you have changes in the water budget, you have temperature changes, growing season length changes, and the very structure of the vegetation changes from deserts or grasslands at low elevation to tundra and alpine forest at high elevation. We have similar things going on in the ocean, but they're driven more by the distribution of light, the attenuation of light in the ocean, and the different organic resources associated with the raining out of organic matter produced by photosynthetic organisms and their predators in the surface ocean, sinking slowly into the deeper and deeper parts of the ocean. Again, we look at all of these sorts of images and conceptual figures and data, and we know that somehow climate is shaping the patterns and abundance of organisms on the planet. But you know, I would love to be standing here and telling you that we understand really how and why that works, but we really don't. And I want that to be really one of the central messages of this. We really don't understand very well why the patterns of life, the specific adaptations of organisms are, in a big sense, in a large scale, distributed over the planet as they are. When we look at it, it makes sense to us, but we can't predict it. And so there's a mystery at the heart of ecological science there, that every decade or so somebody takes a run at a unifying theory, which then takes about a decade to crumble, typically. Well, how does changing climate influence the biota? One way that I think most people are familiar with is through the change in the length of the growing season. As the temperature warms, we see longer and longer growing seasons. The hardiness zones that we all use when we're selecting varieties of vegetables or flowers from our gardens, those hardiness zones have moved hundreds of kilometers over the past 30 years. So if you look at a life zone map for tomatoes from, say, 1970, it's absolutely dramatically different from one produced for today. So we have very tangible evidence of these changes in growing season and their direct links to biology. If these changes are affecting tomatoes, they're certainly affecting oaks and weeds and mice and other creatures. Just to give a little perspective on the rate of change, I like always to look back. This is work by my friend Jack Williams, and it's looking at the relative abundance of several types of trees, conifers, broadleafed, and herbaceous vegetation, grasses and flowers, in two types of forests. One of them, of course, is the one that we're in right now, which is the temperate deciduous forest here in Ohio. And this shows the relative abundance of species going back basically to the deglaciation after the last ice age. And what you see is after the several thousand-year transition out of the ice age climate, you see several thousand, almost 10,000 years of relatively stable abundances. These are over large areas, the entire Midwest. But we see relatively stable abundances of these major groups of species until we reach the period we call the Anthropocene, the modern period where geologic processes are actually showing the imprint of human activity. And all of a sudden at the end, you see these rates of change begin to jump. And you can see this even in the pollen records that these figures are produced from. So we see, again, a period of relative stability with a certain amount of natural variability, changes in the frequency of wildfire. There's probably influences of changes in Native American culture in there. But then all of a sudden we get to about 100 years ago and we begin to see these very dramatic reorganizations of species abundances in forests. So we can see not only is the climate changing very quickly, But when we take the long view, we can see that indeed the biota are beginning to respond, and at very high rates. Now, having said that, the rates that we can observe in this figure are probably driven mainly by land use change. They're driven by clearing for agriculture, by timber harvest. They're driven by human preferences for certain tree species because of their economic or construction values, and only secondarily driven by climate, again, until the very end of this record. Because, again, we're now looking over a very long view, and these data intrinsically kind of smooth things out. But we can see some of these changes happening on much shorter time scales. This is the average change in the center of abundance for bird species in North America. Probably the largest and greatest citizen science effort in the world are the two bird censuses done in the United States, the Breeding Bird Survey and the Christmas bird count. These data are combined from those two projects, and they show this very significant change. These are miles to the north, where one finds the center of abundance, analyzing literally millions of observations of hundreds of different bird species. So we see a very systematic change. Again, this is what we mean by the velocity of climate change. This is a very large group of species, the birds, the migratory birds in particular, changing their geographic distribution in response to changing climate. And we observe this even with, frankly, the Christmas bird count and the Breeding Bird Survey, the CBC and the BBS, are blunt instruments, right? Volunteers go out, some areas get sampled, some areas don't get sampled. They're typically done as road surveys, so people are driving along roads, they're not searching things out. But thousands of people participate and have been doing so for the better part of a century. So we have large numbers helping us out with sampling design, and we can see when we look at basically all of that data, this very dramatic pattern. Again, this is the velocity of climate change as it's expressed in a relatively mobile group of organisms. There's no way that trees are going to be able to move as fast as birds do. But ultimately, if the trees don't move, then the birds are going to have a problem because they are associated with certain species, either for structure and habitat or for food. And so there's the possibility that because species move at different rates, that they will eventually get out of sync with each other. And there again is some evidence that we're already beginning to see that sort of dynamic process occurring today. One of the points that I want to make, again, is how little we actually know about this. My colleagues, Walter Yetz and Rob Gralnick, wrote a paper about what they call the scale gap. They pointed out that we know the height of every place on the Earth, the topography, down to a 90-foot resolution everywhere on the planet from spaceborne measurements. We've measured the elevation above sea level of every point on the planet to within about 10 centimeters and with a 30-meter footprint on the ground. And that's the declassified version of the data. I am told that the actual data is far better than that. By contrast, we know the distribution of species typically to within 500 to 1,000 kilometers. So we know the distribution of life on Earth 10 to 100 times less well than we know how high we are. And because of that lack of resolution, there are many things that we simply cannot understand from the data because we don't have enough resolution. It's a little bit like looking through a telescope that has water all over the lens. We can see some things through that telescope, but we can't see very clearly. And if we try to measure things through that cloudy telescope, we're not going to be able to make very accurate measurements, because where the lens is dry, we'll get nice sharp images, but where it's not, we'll get fuzzy images, and we won't really know how to measure distances. Well, that's a little bit what it's like when we look at biological diversity. When we look at this, again, we can see this is just for plants. This is just for vascular plants. The raw data is shown above. And what you can see there is, for example, there are no data in the Amazon basin. Right? Well, there aren't no data in the Amazon basin. There are some data in the Amazon basin, but they're incredibly sparse, and they're typically collected in areas that, rather than being representative of the Amazon basin, are actually just easy to get to. We think that there are 16,000 tree species in the Amazon basin, but we know that on the basis of about that many observations, so that number is extrapolated. Now, we can build a mathematical model that relates those raw data to a number of independent variables like temperature, water balance, topography, and we can then make a map that makes it look as if we know a great deal about the distribution of plant diversity over the planet. And by employing sophisticated statistical techniques, we can make the map down below that appears to fill those patterns in even better. But the reality is that we know it as well as is shown on the upper panel. We're extraordinarily data limited. Remember, that upper panel has a few thousand points at most. Remember that every point on the planet, we've measured the elevation to within 90 feet. So this is tens of thousands of times less data about life than topography. And the degree of inference, the degree of understanding we can obtain is really scaled to the abundance of data, because biology is fundamentally a data-driven science. It's not a theory-driven science. We can't make a prediction that will fill in between these points. We have no theory that will do that. And even if we did, it would be influenced by things like where there was a fire and where there wasn't, where there's a farm and where there isn't. So it's not like in a fluid where you can sort of predict its dynamics. This would be like a fluid that has a bunch of drain holes and faucets at random locations pouring in or out of it. You have to know where they are. The theory won't tell you that. If we look at productivity and diversity, we can see, again, that there are some relationships between these two properties of the biosphere. And again, this is a subject that has fascinated ecologists, at least since the 1960s, but probably since the Roman era or maybe before. And again, we see high diversity and high productivity in more humid and warmer areas, lower productivity and lower diversity in colder and more arid regions. And we really don't know whether this is a coincidence, that is, both of these properties, productivity and diversity, are responding to climate, or is one of them driven by climate and the other responding. Current theory predicts, based on this concept called species energy modeling, that it's the patterns of productivity that allow for the radiation of life and the diversity. That is, it's the productivity that results in the diversity. And yet, that would only be true if climate were absolutely constant, and it never has been. So I'll show you some results counter to that idea. This is an experiment using a computer model where we implemented a simulation of climate change with two levels of diversity. And so if you look at the lower dashed line, we're simulating a planet that has very low diversity. In any given region, there's just one species. In the upper line, we're simulating a planet where there's high diversity, perhaps as many as 2,000 species in any given region. And what we see in this model calculation over the next 100 years is that the diverse world takes up far more carbon than the simple world. And the reason for that is that as the climate starts to change, in the simple world, you have one species in one area, and if it's not suited to the new climate, then it just doesn't do well. It might even die. Whereas in the diverse world, as the climate begins to change, the probability that one of those remaining species will be successful in growing is much, much higher. And so as a result, we see a massive difference. Now, we can do this kind of experiment numerically on the computer. Unfortunately, we're actually doing this experiment in the real world, and we don't have a control. There's another possibility. The other possibility is that the diverse world would actually be less productive. The argument there would be that species can't actually change fast enough to maintain some sort of adaptation, and that, in fact, instead of the better adapted species moving into an environment where they can be successful, they're still stuck in an area and they can't move to where they need to be. So this is an optimistic view. This is a it would be nice if kind of a view. It may work for some groups of organisms and not for others. For example, it may work that the world may work rather well this way for mobile organisms, trees that disperse widely, and not well at all for ones that don't disperse widely, depending on their seed biology. So we increasingly believe that not only is the diversity of the planet and its function, its ability to take up carbon, process water, and so on, not only are they correlated with each other, but they probably are just two sides of the same coin. It's just that, as I'll say on my last slide, I'll go for my punchline, we just don't know where the coin is. You know, we know that they're somehow related to some underlying attributes of biology, but we have no theory to explain what it is that links them together that adequately accounts for all the facts. Now, while the climate shapes life on the planet, the reciprocal is also true. The distribution of the biota have a big impact on the physical climate of the planet. I'm not going to go through all of the many ways in which this occurs. There's a vast scholarly literature on this topic that's grown up over the past few decades. There's a pretty reasonable review of it in the book, if anyone has a couple bucks to throw around. But one of the primary ways in which life shapes the planet is through the carbon cycle. And the way we understand that is through what we call the carbon budget. The carbon budget describes the transfer of carbon from the geologic reservoir, where it would be normally stable on plate tectonic timescales, that is, tens of millions of years. Transfer of carbon from inert geologic forms into what we call the fast carbon cycle, the land biosphere, the ocean, and the atmosphere. And that is occurring at the rate of about 8 billion metric tons per year. Actually, that's the average for the last decade. The current rate is higher. Of that 8 billion metric tons, about half accumulates in the atmosphere, leading to the average increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide of a few parts per million per year. About half of it is absorbed by the oceans through a physical-chemical process. It's absorbed into the surface ocean. It's fixed by organisms, which are then transported, at least fractionally, into the deep ocean, where that carbon can be stored for hundreds to thousands of years. And about half of it disappears into the land. So you can think about that in terms of the climate, that the biosphere and the oceans are providing about a 50% climate subsidy to the industrial metabolism of the planet. That is, for every barrel of gas or oil that we burn, about half of the CO2 is not affecting the climate. Instead, it's in the ocean or it's in the biosphere. Now, if that number were to change, if the biosphere or the oceans were to absorb more carbon, then we could burn more fuel with the same impact on the climate. If the opposite were true, if a higher fraction of fossil fuel carbon remained in the atmosphere, then there would be a bigger climate impact for each unit of energy used on the planet. So the understanding these, we call them feedbacks in the carbon cycle, is very important to thinking about the future of the industrial world. It's very important to thinking about the environmental externalities of our energy economy. It's a place where thinking about the economics and the engineering of the energy sector and the geophysical response of the Earth system come very close together. And as a result, you have these funny meetings with people who all know calculus, but that's about all they have in common, trying to talk across vast disciplinary chasms. Again, I would argue strongly that we've clearly not organized ourselves right. When we look at the carbon cycle from the point of view of the atmosphere is a great research instrument. It's like having a wonderful, wonderful instrument in your laboratory. It's incredibly sensitive. It tells you everything, but it doesn't always, it's a little bit like a riddle. The answer is there if only you know what the question was. So this is a very famous figure. This is sort of the icon of climate change. This is the Keeling curve that began in the 1950s by Charles David Keeling, now continued by NOAA and many other agencies. And it shows several important things. First, it shows the steady, inexorable increase in atmospheric CO2 from fossil fuel burning. And if you plot fossil fuel burning on this same figure, you'll see that they're almost perfectly correlated over, say, 10-year periods. You can also see the annual cycle of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that is driven by photosynthesis on land in the northern hemisphere during the summer and respiration in the wintertime. And so, because the world is asymmetrical, most of the land is in the north, most of the water is in the south, we see this big impact. If everything were even, you wouldn't see it because the southern hemisphere would just offset the northern hemisphere. We also see that the curve isn't perfectly smooth. We can see years where there are little dips. Is this a pointer? Yes. No. No. So, for example, in 1973, you can see that the curve levels off for a few years. That's one of the few cases where energy conservation actually worked. Those are the years of the OPEC oil embargo, when the price of gasoline jumped dramatically and people discovered fuel efficiency. So for a period of a few years, there was actually a huge reduction in fossil fuel consumption. There's another one of those little dips associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are also places where the curve gets very steep. There's one in 1997 that reflects a massive drought in Indonesia that led to wildfires in some of the highest carbon ecosystems of the world. So we really see the history of the world in the carbon cycle here. Again, the answers are all there. It's just hard to figure out what the right question is. We can also look at the results at much higher resolution. And here we see, again, the seasonal cycle. And you can begin to see that the shape and the size of the seasonal cycle are beginning to change a little bit over time. It's very hard to see that here. But what we see is that the amplitude of the seasonal cycle, the difference between the peak wintertime concentration and the minimum summertime concentration, is actually changing. And again, that has to be telling us something about the biosphere, but we really don't know what. We have many explanations, but we haven't been able to exclude very many of them yet. Finally, I want to lead into my concluding point. By looking at the budget of carbon over time, I used to think that budgets were really boring. That, yeah, you had to look at budgets, but just adding up numbers and making sure that when you add them up, they sum to zero didn't seem very interesting. I never liked balancing my checkbook. But it turns out that there's tremendous information in looking at the budget of carbon over time. And one of the things that's become clearer and clearer, and is really quite mysterious, is that the uptake of carbon by the ocean has increased over time. And you can see in 1960, it's taking up carbon at like 1 or 2 petagrams, billion metric tons per year. by 2010, it's taking up about twice that. And we understand that because it's a physical, chemical, concentration gradient-driven phenomenon. Theory predicts it, models replicate it, it makes sense, we understand it. But uptake by the land biosphere has also been increasing. And it's not at all obvious why that should be. 10 years ago, we believed that most of that uptake was the recovery from land use that had occurred in the previous century. That is, forests regrowing in places very much like this that were wall-to-wall farm in the late colonial, early federal period, but which are now reverting to forest. And that's a phenomenon that's widespread in North America and Europe, and it seemed to account for a lot of what was going on. But there's no reason why that would lead to an increase over the last 30 years in carbon uptake. If anything, you'd expect that sort of recovery to be slowing down as the trees get larger and larger, as the areas that are infilling become fewer and fewer, and as people start to clear again, either for timber or for housing or whatever. So why would this be going on? Why would the biosphere be providing an increasing subsidy that, if you look at fossil fuel emissions, which is that gray area, they're actually kind of proportional to each other. So the argument that plant physiologists have made is that as CO2 increases in the atmosphere, it becomes easier for plants to do photosynthesis. That is, photosynthesis is also a concentration-driven phenomenon for very complicated reasons that have to do with competition with oxygen. The higher the concentration of CO2, the more efficient photosynthesis becomes. And there are many arguments that this explains some of the patterns of species distribution that we see in the paleo record over millions or thousands of years. However, theory predicts that sensitivity should be proportional to photosynthetic rate. That is, the higher the photosynthetic rate, the more stimulation you should get by CO2. And there's a very important paper by Hal Mooney in 1991 that laid out a beautiful theory for how the effect of CO2 should be distributed over the planet. This is a very recent numerical model experiment, and so I have to go through just a little bit the format of this figure. One of the things that climate scientists like to do is we like to look at things, as we say, zonally. So this plot goes from the South Pole to the North Pole. The North Pole is on the right, the South Pole, and then we've just collapsed the planet from a sphere into a line. And so we're looking at what happens as a function of latitude. So we're not looking at east and west, we've averaged over east and west. And what we see is that photosynthesis is high in the tropics, and the effect of CO2 is high in the mid-latitudes. Well, those are the two regions where we have high plant growth. They're separated by the deserts of the southern part of the northern hemisphere, and of course it tapers off as you go towards the poles. So this is a model calculation. It's translating Mooney's publication into theory and showing that, yes, when you integrate all of the factors, it predicts that there should be a gradient associated with climate with some effect of CO2 in the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes and a very large effect of CO2 in the southern hemisphere humid tropics. The problem with this was that at the same time we were also using the gradients, very tiny gradients of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere to calculate where carbon uptake was occurring. And those models predicted that carbon uptake was occurring in the northern hemisphere and that the tropics were not active in taking up carbon. And so those two results, those two types of models, they contradicted each other. But one was a prediction from theory, and the other was an observation, an analysis of data. And so when you have a theory and data disagreeing, you know, a dirty little secret, a lot of people will believe the theory and assume the data are wrong. But in this case, the data were confirmed over and over again. And so no one could understand what was wrong with the theory. but the data seemed to refute it. The data seemed to say that carbon uptake by the biosphere, which is increasing, just what you'd expect from a carbon dioxide concentration effect, was occurring in the wrong place. So what was going on? So this is the hard part of the talk. What I'm going to do is not really hope that everyone will understand this analysis, but to give you a sense of how we approach understanding the global system, how we play different types of data and models off against each other. So this shows the kind of collaborative behavior that's typical of the earth sciences. These are analyses using the gradients of CO2 in the atmosphere, the fact that CO2 is lower over areas of rapid growth and higher over areas of deserts and slow growth. It's higher in the winter than in the summer. We use that information to infer what the biological uptake has to be. We're using the atmosphere as an instrument. But to do that, we have to do a lot of calculations. To do those calculations, we need to make assumptions. And luckily, we have lots of people out there working on this, making different assumptions, and we can play them off against each other. Now, these lines show the fits to these many attempts to infer uptake in the tropical land and the northern land. And the points all lie around these lines because we all agree on what's happening in the atmosphere, right? We know how much CO2 increase is going on in the atmosphere. We all agree on how much is being burned as fossil fuel. We more or less agree on what the oceans are doing. But all those numbers have some uncertainty, so we don't get exactly the same balance. But all of the models are calculating about the same overall global carbon budget. They just disagree about where the land uptake is. Is it in the tropics or is it in the mid-latitudes? And the older model experiments, shown in red, predicted this northern hemisphere uptake, the result that contradicted the Mooney theory for photosynthetic stimulation by carbon dioxide. And the cross there shows the consensus of the scientific community around 2003, that there couldn't be lots of uptake in the tropics. Uptake, by the way, is negative because it's going out of the atmosphere. The atmospheric scientists won the sign wars here. So interestingly, in the late 2000s, my colleague Britt Stevens said, well, that's interesting. These models all disagree, and they appear to disagree with theory. What if we were to evaluate the models against a new type of data? And so what he did was he took vertical profiles of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, measured by putting very sensitive instruments on aircraft and flying from the ground up to the top of the troposphere and back. And he said, okay, well, all of these models fit the surface observations about equally well. They get different answers because they move CO2 around in the atmosphere in different ways. But let's see which of these models also predict the vertical gradient of CO2 in the atmosphere. And when he did this, what he found was the lower cross. He found a result that suggested that land uptake was lower than the previous consensus. Smaller is going from left to right because of the sign convention. So while the earlier models were predicting sort of 3 billion metric tons per year, after Britt applied his correction, they were predicting somewhat under 2. And interestingly, they also predicted that tropical uptake had to increase. Now, I know it says 0 there. Britt's cross is on the 0. We know that every year deforestation releases about 3 billion metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And if the atmosphere doesn't see that, then a sink, an uptake, needs to balance that deforestation. So 0 in the tropics implies uptake of up to 3 billion metric tons per year. So again, we're combining lots of different types of information here to try and understand whether the atmosphere is or is not refuting the Mooney theory. So now we bring in two different types of data. So the purple lines show going out deforestation. That is, they show that the tropics are releasing about 3 billion metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere each year. And we know this from very detailed analysis of satellite data, of measurements of trees laboriously collected on the ground, statistics about timber harvest, all put together in very complex analyses. But now we also have estimates of the growth of intact tropical forest trees because of field studies that were begun 20 and 30 years ago, where people go back and they measure thousands and thousands of trees, and they measure them every 5 years. And from those changes over time, they can calculate the increase in the total carbon storage of tropical forests. And they also do this in areas that were deforested and are now regrowing. And what you see is that you can only explain the atmospheric result if you assume that you have both uptake in intact forests and regrowth. And that uptake in intact forests is likely driven by increasing carbon dioxide. We get a similar result when we use ecosystem models, which are shown in green. Models are kind of cool because we can turn the effect of CO2 on and off. We can tell the model that CO2 is increasing and calculate how much carbon they predict will be taken up. And then we can tell the model whatever we want. We can tell it that CO2 is not increasing. And what we find is that when we turn the fertilization effect off, the models do not agree with the atmospheric constraint. They predict northern hemisphere and tropical uptakes that are wrong, or at least that are inconsistent with the atmospheric budgets. But when we turn carbon dioxide fertilization on, they move into rough agreement with our other observational studies. And so what we've tried to do here is really what scientists are supposed to do. That is, we had a theory, we tested it, the agreement wasn't good, we went back and we looked at the data again and we checked again, and we checked different ways, and then we tried to get at the problem from different perspectives, using the atmosphere, using harvest data, and using models. And when we put all of this information together, including the advanced sampling of the vertical structure of the atmosphere, we get a result that suggests that there's a big tropical uptake, that in fact Mooney's theory is not falsified. We haven't proved it. We never prove anything. But we used to think that we had falsified that theory, and we can no longer do that. And that's actually the way things advance. It doesn't actually reduce our discomfort. We still don't know what's going on, and we'd like to know what's going on. But at least we can't reject one plausible explanation. Now, I want to talk about this. So this is a really interesting result. I'm incredibly excited about it. I have a paper about this being reviewed in a prestigious journal. I'm terrified of what my colleagues are going to say. But the most interesting thing about this, in some sense, is what did it take to put this analysis together? Well, first of all, it took technology and dedication of the people who measure carbon dioxide everywhere around the world to put these global budgets together that can be used in numerical models to calculate carbon dioxide uptake from atmospheric concentration data. Doing that calculation requires a deep knowledge of the physics of the atmosphere. So it brings in a second group of people, people who are specialists in atmospheric science. But we can't explain the atmosphere, we can only describe with it. So now we need to go to people who understand forest management, forest harvest, and forest measurement. So now we've brought in, if you will, applied biologists. We've brought in forest scientists, many of whom are actually economists or geographers who look at the distribution of forest harvest, who look at the entire processing chain of timber from harvest to eventual landfilling or burning in order to figure out the fate of these forests. We have to have, in order to even do these calculations, very good understanding of the fossil fuel economy of the world. We need to know how much fuel is burned, we need to know where it's burned, and we need to know what season it's burned in. So again, that brings in energy sector folks, economists, engineers, and geographers. And then the modeling requires yet another kind of intersection between biology and applied mathematics. So to do this analysis takes like half of the science disciplines, both natural and social, that exist on this planet. And this is very characteristic of trying to understand the Earth system, that it requires deep collaboration, and it requires more knowledge in each of these areas than any one person is likely to have. I'm pretty good at putting all these pieces together, but if you gave me any one of these pieces, I would go find a friend. So this now is what we think beta, this is the effect of carbon dioxide on photosynthesis, looks like, and we can make maps of it based on these models, and we can evaluate these predictions against observations at the planetary scale. And I believe this is the first map of this sort of phenomenon that we've ever been able to test that way. And it really speaks to the growing sophistication and the enormous amounts of data that are collected in this arena. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of comments about both climate and ecosystems and the enterprise of understanding them. First, that biology is as much a part of the climate as rainfall is. In fact, biology influences rainfall. And the distinction between the life and earth sciences is, in my opinion, dramatically artificial. The composition of the biosphere, its diversity, the species and their characteristics, and the function of the biosphere, its productivity, its ability to capture and store carbon, are two sides of the same coin, but we really don't know what's in the middle of that coin. It might be silver, it might be lead, it might be gold. We have no idea. We see strong correlations between these two attributes of the biosphere, and we really fundamentally do not understand at a planetary scale how they are related to each other. NASA loves that question, my new boss, because that makes this a planetary problem. If we could understand it on Earth, we could maybe understand it on one of the other 40 billion planets that Kepler appears to have discovered. Understanding the grand cycles of the planetary biosphere, but bringing in its component parts, the organisms and species that make it up, is really one of the grand challenges for science today. And it requires people who think and are trained in a new way. And so my final thoughts are really on that subject. The biosphere is an integral part of the planet, of the Earth system. But we don't train our students to think that way. We train them to be geologists or meteorologists or ecologists, and then within those big bins, we train them to be terrestrial or aquatic or marine or sedimentary or igneous. We train them to think about weather or climate, but the science problems don't map into those handy distinctions very well anymore. We certainly don't make policy based on this understanding that the geosphere, the biosphere, and the atmosphere interact with each other. We tend to break those down into little bins as well. We don't consider climate change when we make fisheries policy. We don't consider climate when we make forest policy. And certainly, since I'm at a university, our departments aren't organized this way. They're not organized around the planet. They're organized around, again, the way we thought the planet worked somewhere 1,000, 2,000 years ago when we were inventing the university. It was a great invention. It's had amazing enduring power. And yet it's part of its success is that enduring power, which makes it hard to change. We also aren't providing, at least in my experience, exactly the right toolkit for people to think about either understanding the planet or managing it. And I've thought long and hard. I've had many graduate students and undergrad students that I've worked with. And I've thought for years about what's the winning combination. What turns students on, what enables them to work in these in these complex problems that we call interdisciplinary, but which I think of as being sort of post-disciplinary. And I keep coming down to these three things. First, what I'll call biophilia. That is an interest in and a desire to understand the living world. It's really difficult to turn someone on to thinking about the planet this way if industrial sense, trying not too big with only simple or qualitative tools, although they also can't be understood without simple or qualitative tools. And so I've used mathematics as a shorthand for all of the tools, numerical, computational, analytical, visualization, that enable us to understand big problems. Again, some of that is mathematics in a kind of a classical sense, some of it is informatics. Different people come to it from different ways. But it's hard to do this if all you want to do is manipulate living material in the laboratory, because we're trying to understand enormous volumes of information. And finally, very few of these problems can be tackled by somebody acting alone. And so the final skill that I've observed in my successful students who've really moved into this sort of Earth systems approach is teamwork. And the thing that I've come to understand over the years is that, you know, I think I always thought, without having thought about it deeply, and I think many people think that teamwork is something that you're either good at or you're not. And certainly in the sciences, we talk about people being good team members and not, and we don't think of it very deeply at all. But it's actually a learned skill. People can learn to work in teams. They can learn how to exercise the role of collaborator or leader. And in fact, people can understand that you can be a leader some of the time, and you can be a contributor some of the time. And in my current NASA environment, that behavior is encouraged or perhaps even enforced. People move between technical roles and leadership roles all the time, and if they're not good at one or the other, they get trained to do it. We've had a very individual-oriented culture in many of the sciences. We don't teach our students to work together, either as leaders or collaborators, very effectively. And yet this kind of scientific approach requires people who can sit in a room and work respectfully, if not agreeably, with each other. And because simply these problems are too big for individuals to tackle. And they don't lend themselves to the top-down model very well, because that still winds up with the person at the top having to have their head wrapped around the entire problem. And these problems don't lend themselves to that kind of management. So I'd like to really just to wrap up and think that, you know, smaller universities are much more agile than bigger universities. And there's a real opportunity for thinking about this complex world and how to build bridges, how to train people, how to educate people who can think about the planet as it is, rather than as the planet as it is organized in academic disciplines. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions.
You want me to pick them? Or
Actually, I'll bring you the microphone. I saw Gordon's hand here.
Yes, thank you. It was a very interesting talk. One of the things, though, that I thought I had read some years ago is that some of the FACE experiments showed that there was increased fertilization for about the first 5 years in a plant, and then it kind of disappeared. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there was a paper in the proceedings, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, that basically said that if we increase the temperature too much so that the average temperature is greater for humans than about 35 degrees Celsius, that we would make a large part of the biosphere uninhabitable by humans and other vertebrates that have a constant body temperature, because we could not use the external environment to get rid of the heat that we generate to keep our body temperature constant. And so I'm wondering if you remember that paper. I can't remember the authors at the moment. And if you have any comments about those two questions.
So on the first one of the ways we've tried to understand the effect of increasing CO2 is by actually increasing CO2 experimentally. The problem with that is that theory tells us that carbon uptake results from the rate of increase in photosynthesis. That is, photosynthesis has to increase faster than respiration. And so it's absolutely to be expected that if you increase CO2 to a new constant level, the system will eventually equilibrate. And when you look at the mathematics of CO2 fertilization, it's the derivative of CO2 with time, and the difference between the effect of CO2 on photosynthesis and the residence time of the carbon that is fixed that creates the carbon uptake. And so there's kind of a fundamental conceptual flaw in the experiment. What it can do is it can tell you about the impacts on photosynthesis, but it gives you the steady state answer, and what we're seeing in the real world is not a steady state solution. And so we try to use those experiments not to simulate the future, but to identify parameters that can be included in models. And so it's an area of real scientific challenge to bridge those gaps. On the second, I didn't talk about the effects of climate. I talked about this effect that was directly through the role of ecosystems. But clearly from the first part of my talk, you can see that if you begin to move climate around, it's going to have massive, and observationally we know now, generally negative effects using human values. We lose productivity, we lose species, we lose predictability of agriculture at higher temperatures. There are negative effects on lots of animals. We're seeing them most rapidly in the mountains, where creatures are running out of habitat. That is, they're migrating upslope, but mountains are pointy, and so as you go further and further up, there's less and less there. Again, there's a whole nother presentation to be given on the effects of changing climate on the biosphere. And for the most part, it's not a pretty story based on what we know from observations now.
Thanks. Have you seen, there was recently a work published about, right now, we're predicted to hit 9 billion people in about 2050. And the amount of land that we're using for agricultural production to feed the current level population is roughly the size of the continent of South America. And they project that when we hit 9 billion, we're going to need another continent-sized region somewhere on the planet to feed these extra people. Has anyone correlated that need with the rate of climate change models that
So people have started to do that. Right now, about 15% of the planet is in arable land, that is to say, crop agriculture, and another, there are various numbers, but it's twice that or so, 30%-ish, is used for the production of livestock. Of course, those aren't independent of each other, because a lot of the arable land is used to produce feed for livestock. And so if you imagine the population increasing by another 30%, you have to imagine either intensification of agriculture or expansion of agriculture. And the areas involved are vast, as you implied. At the same time, the regions of the planet that are suitable for agriculture are not infinite, and they're not only constrained by climate. You have to have appropriate climate, you need to have water available, soils, and then secondarily transport, and so on and so forth. It's my understanding that the forthcoming Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment is going to present a fairly dismal view of the ability of agriculture to support a growing human population in the face of rapid climate change. There are only 7 major regions on the planet that support 80% of food production. And there's kind of 1 per continent, more or less. And if there were lots of other places that were suitable for agriculture, one can assume that they would be farmed. But we have the vast continental interiors that are hot and cold and dry. We have areas in the tropics where the soils are difficult to sustain agriculture on. And so I think food security in a changing climate is a serious issue. Until very recently, the most agricultural modeling for the future was based really in an economic paradigm, and there were underlying assumptions that as food production became more difficult, prices would increase and that there would be technical solutions. And I wouldn't discount that. Farmers and the agricultural industry, they're both extremely creative and adaptable groups. But what is clear is that they will be facing increasingly severe challenges that'll have to be addressed. And many of the technologies that are available to do that are not, shall we say, universally well received. In fact, they're banned in major parts of the world. So I think the agriculture story is an interesting one. It's not my area directly, but I follow it, and it's anxiety producing.
Other questions? All right, let's thank Dr. Schimel again. And I'd like you to invite you to come forward if you'd like to have a book signed. And there are books available for purchase right outside the door.